When it comes to the heroes of ancient Greece, Agamemnon is often portrayed as a powerful ruler. But behind this image lies a series of horrific deeds that turn our perception of him upside down. His life is marred by sacrifices, betrayal, and divine wrath, making him a figure worthy of the nickname the Dark Cardinal. Today, we will delve into the unknown sins of this ruler, revealing how ambition and curses led to a tragedy that is rarely mentioned in history textbooks. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let's get started. To understand the magnitude of Agamemnon's personality, you need to mentally transport yourself to his domain, the Golden Mycenae. It is not just a city, it is a fortress, a citadel whose walls, according to legend, were built by the Cyclopes themselves. Huge, roughly hewn stone blocks, weighing several tons, were fitted together with such precision that it was impossible to insert a knife blade between them. Standing on top of these walls, Agamemnon saw before him not just fields and groves, but a symbol of his power carved in stone. He was no ordinary king. He was a Wonax, a supreme ruler, first among equals among the Achaean kings. His word carried weight, not because he was wiser than Odysseus or stronger than Ajax, but because he had the power of Mycenae behind him, their untold treasures and the largest army. His power was secured not so much by laws as by authority and force. When the 19th century archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated Mycenae and opened the shaft tombs, he discovered treasures that astonished the world. One of the gold burial masks found was so magnificent that Schliemann, without hesitation, telegraphed the Greek king, "I have looked into the face of Agamemnon." Although modern analysis has shown that the mask was created 300 to 400 years before the supposed time of the Trojan War, it has forever become a symbol of that era. It reflects not a specific king, but the very idea of a Mycenaean ruler. A stern, rich, and powerful ruler whose face is hidden behind impassive gold. Such was Agamemnon, a function, a symbol of the united power of the Achaeans, a man who was given the right to lead dozens of kings and hundreds of thousands of warriors. And now, this colossus of power found himself trapped. In Aulis, where the fleet had gathered, there was complete calm. The seer Calchas, a man whose words made even kings tremble, delivered his verdict. The goddess Artemis, the huntress, was angry. Once, after killing a sacred doe while hunting, Agamemnon boasted that even the goddess herself would envy his marksmanship. For such arrogance, for hubris, a terrible price was set. In order for the wind to fill the sails of the Achaean ships again, the supreme commander must sacrifice what is most precious to him, his eldest daughter, Iphigenia. The wind gently ruffles the hair of the young girl who has arrived at the military camp. She looks around joyfully, expecting to see her fiancé, the great Achilles, the hero of song. The warriors, who yesterday were sullen and angry, make way for her, but their eyes show not joy, but a strange mixture of pity and horror. They are silent. Her father meets her, but his embrace is cold, and his gaze is fixed somewhere over her shoulder, where a sacrificial altar has already been erected on the shore. Iphigenia does not yet know that her wedding is a lie, and that instead of wedding hymns, a funeral song will soon be sung. The decision made by Agamemnon is described by ancient Greek tragedians, such as Euripides, not as an act of fanaticism, but as a cold political calculation. He was faced with a choice. Either he loses face, disbands the army and goes down in history as a coward and a failure, or he makes a sacrifice and fulfills his mission. He chose power. He sent a messenger to his wife Clytemnestra with a false letter informing her of the alleged upcoming wedding of Iphigenia to Achilles. The deception worked. The girl was brought to the camp, and there, in front of the entire army, her father gave the order to take her to the altar. In some versions of the myth, Artemis took pity at the last moment and replaced the girl with a doe, carrying Iphigenia away to Taurus to make her a priestess. But for the army, for Clytemnestra, and, most importantly, for Agamemnon himself, the sacrifice took place. He crossed the line beyond which a father becomes a monster and a ruler becomes a tyrant, willing to pay any price for success. The wind blew. The fleet set sail for Troy. But the price of that wind would haunt Agamemnon until the very end. Almost 10 years have passed. 10 long years of exhausting siege, skirmishes, and raids. The great goal, the capture of Troy, has still not been achieved. The army is tired, and its leaders are mired in internal strife. And here, Agamemnon commits his second great sin, which this time stems not from despair, but from pure arrogance. During one of the raids on the surrounding cities, the Achaeans captured many prisoners. Among them was a girl named Chryseis, who was rightfully given to Agamemnon as his share of the spoils, his geras. But Chryseis was not just a captive. She was the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo. Soon her father arrived at the Achaean camp. The old man brought with him untold treasures for ransom, and, leaning on his priestly staff, humbly begged Agamemnon to return his daughter. Any sensible Greek would understand that refusing a priest of a powerful god was a direct insult to the deity himself. But Agamemnon, intoxicated by his power as commander-in-chief, rudely and humiliatingly drove the old man away, threatening him with death if he ever appeared in the camp again. This act, with which Homer's Iliad begins, is not simply greed. It is a demonstration that the king of Mycenae considers himself above divine law. The consequences were not long in coming. The offended Apollo heard the prayers of his priest and unleashed his wrath on the Achaean camp. The god began to strike the army with invisible arrows. First, mules and dogs died, and then a terrible plague, loimos, began to mow down people. For 9 days in a row, funeral pyres burned incessantly, and the stench of burning bodies filled the air. The army was on the verge of complete destruction, not because of the Trojan swords, but because of the arrogance of one man. Agamemnon once again put the entire army at risk, but this time not for the common good, but for his own pride and possession of a captive. Before passing final judgment on this character, consider the nature of power that demands such sacrifices and breeds such blindness. The next time you hear a story about a leader making a controversial decision in the name of a higher goal, take a closer look to see if behind the glamour of great ideas there is a shadow of personal ambition and a price that others will pay. It was at this moment, when the camp was suffocating from plague and soldiers were dying without seeing the enemy, that Agamemnon was forced to convene a general assembly. But even in the face of disaster, his first reaction was not remorse, but rage directed at the one who dared to speak the truth. When the seer Calchas, having secured the protection of Achilles himself, announced that the cause of Apollo's anger was the insult to his priest, Agamemnon exploded. His eyes, as Homer says, were like flashing flames. He accused the seer of always predicting only misfortune for him, And although he agreed to return Chryseis in order to save the army, he did so with a proviso that became the trigger for the entire subsequent tragedy. He demanded compensation, immediately. He, the supreme commander, could not be left without his honorable share, without his geras. It would have been a public humiliation, a loss of tima, honor, which was more precious to a Greek hero than life itself. And his gaze fell on Achilles. It was Achilles, the mightiest of warriors, who forced him to make concessions. And it was from Achilles that he decided to take his military trophy, the beautiful captive Briseis. It was not just the capture of a woman. It was a slap in the face, a deliberate and public humiliation of the greatest hero. At that moment, Agamemnon acted not as a wise ruler, but as a petty tyrant settling personal scores. The quarrel that broke out at that meeting exposed all the rot at the top of the Achaean command. Achilles, a demigod, son of the sea goddess Thetis, barely restrained himself from drawing his sword and killing Agamemnon on the spot. Only the intervention of the goddess Athena, invisible to others, stopped his hand. But the words they exchanged were sharper than any sword. Achilles called him a drunkard with the eyes of a dog and the heart of a deer, a greedy ruler who hides behind the backs of brave warriors. In response, Agamemnon only strengthened his resolve. He sent his heralds to Achilles' tent, and they, trembling with fear, took Briseis away. The consequences of this act were catastrophic. The offended Achilles refused to fight. He sat by his ships and watched as the Trojans, led by the great Hector, pressed the Achaeans, as his comrades died by the hundreds, as the enemy approached the camp itself, threatening to burn the fleet. Achilles' anger, menin, became the central theme of the Iliad, and this anger was caused solely by Agamemnon's arrogance and short-sightedness. The supreme commander, who had sacrificed his daughter for the sake of victory, was now ready to destroy the entire army to satisfy his own ego. He even tried later to get Briseis back, offering countless gifts, but it was too late. The wound inflicted on his pride was too deep. But where did all this darkness come from in one man? Were these sins, sacrificing his daughter, sacrilege, tyrannical pride, merely his personal choice? Or was he just another puppet in the hands of fate, bearing the mark of a much older and more terrible curse? To understand this, one must look into the bloody fog that envelops his entire family, the house of Atreus. This story begins not with Agamemnon, but with his great-grandfather Tantalus, a favorite of the gods, who was honored with the privilege of feasting with them on Olympus. But Tantalus, deciding to test the omniscience of the Olympians, did the unthinkable. He killed his own son, Pelops, prepared him as a feast, and served him to the gods at the banquet. The gods, of course, recognized the terrible meal. They brought Pelops back to life and cast Tantalus into Tartarus, condemning him to eternal torment, standing up to his neck in water, unable to drink, and seeing fruit above his head, unable to eat it. Thus began the curse. Tantalus's son, Pelops, who had been resurrected, continued the bloody tradition. In order to marry the beautiful Hippodamia, he had to defeat her father, King Oenomaus, who killed all of his daughter's suitors in a chariot race. Pelops bribed Oenomaus's charioteer, Myrtilus, promising him half the kingdom and the right of the first night with Hippodamia. Myrtilus replaced the bronze pins on the king's chariot with wax ones. During the race, the wax melted, the chariot fell apart, and Oenomaus perished. But Pelops, instead of fulfilling his promise, threw Myrtilus off a cliff into the sea. As he lay dying, the deceived charioteer cursed Pelops and his entire family. This curse was fully manifested in the fate of Pelops's sons, Atreus, the father of Agamemnon, and his twin brother Thyestes. The brothers hated each other fiercely, disputing power over Mycenae. The symbol of royal power was a golden lamb sent to Atreus by the gods. But Atreus's wife Orope, who secretly loved Thyestes, stole the lamb and gave it to her lover. Thyestes presented the lamb to the people and seized the throne. Atreus was exiled, but he returned, and his revenge was monstrous, surpassing even the wickedness of Tantalus. Pretending that he wanted reconciliation, Atreus invited Phaestus to a feast. He killed his brother's 3 sons and then served their flesh to his father as a delicacy. When Phaestus had eaten his fill, Atreus brought out a platter with the bloody heads and hands of his children. According to legend, the sun turned away in horror and disappeared behind the horizon, unwilling to illuminate such a crime. Thyestes, maddened with grief, cursed Atreus and all his descendants. Agamemnon was the son of this man. He grew up in a palace whose stones remembered the cries of murdered children and the smell of blood. The curse was not just a myth, it was in his blood, in the air he breathed. Every action he took, every outburst of anger, every display of cruelty was merely an echo of those terrible events. He was doomed to repeat the sins of his ancestors. Even his role as a great commander, upon closer inspection, appears questionable. In the Iliad, Homer shows us that he was not only cruel, but also a weak, panicky leader. At one of the most difficult moments of the war, when the Trojans broke through the Achaean defenses, Agamemnon fell into despair. He summoned the leaders and, weeping, proposed surrender, to abandon everything and flee home. The very man who sacrificed his daughter to start this war is now ready to end it in disgrace. Only the angry rebuke of Odysseus and Diomedes brings him to his senses. In another episode, wishing to test the fighting spirit of his troops, he resorts to a strange and dangerous trick. He announces to the soldiers that the gods have ordered them to end the siege and sail home. He expected the warriors to indignantly reject this proposal, but instead, the soldiers, exhausted by 10 years of war, rushed to the ships with joyful cries. Panic ensued, and the Achaean army was on the verge of complete collapse. Once again, it took all of Odysseus's eloquence and determination to stop the flight and restore order. The supreme commander turned out to be a poor psychologist who did not understand his own army. And now, 10 years later, the war is over. Troy has fallen. Agamemnon returns home victorious. He brings with him untold treasures and a new trophy. The captive Trojan princess, Cassandra, a prophetess whose predictions no one ever believed. His wife, Clytemnestra, awaits him in Mycenae. For 10 years, she ruled the kingdom, and for 10 years, she hatched a plan of revenge for her murdered daughter. Nothing remained in her heart but ice and hatred. She was not alone. At her side was Aegisthus, the only surviving son of that very Thyestes whom Atreus had fed his own children to. For Aegisthus, revenge on Agamemnon was a matter of honor, the fulfillment of his father's curse. They were the perfect couple, united by a common goal: to destroy the king of Mycenae. When the signal fire finally flashed on the palace watchtower, announcing the fall of Troy and the king's imminent return, Clytemnestra was ready. She greets her husband with feigned joy and flattering words. She orders her servants to spread purple carpets before him, a path worthy of a victor. It was another trap, subtle and diabolical. To walk on purple, a color reserved for the gods, was an act of the greatest arrogance, the very hubris for which the gods inevitably punished. Agamemnon hesitates. He understands that this is wrong, that it is a challenge to the heavens. But weary of war, blinded by victory and lulled by his wife's sweet words, he gives in. He steps down from his chariot and walks onto the purple path that leads him straight into the trap, into his own palace, which has become his tomb. Cassandra enters the city with him, and here, at the gates of the palace, she is overtaken by a terrifying vision. She, whose prophecies have always been true, but which no one believed, sees everything. She screams in agony that this house is steeped in blood, that she smells the stench of slaughter, that she sees the ghosts of Phaethus' children reaching out with their severed arms. She predicts her own death and the death of Agamemnon, describing his murder in minute detail. "A net! It is the net of Hades!" She speaks of a female murderer, of a bathtub filled with water and blood. The guards and elders of Mycenae look at her as if she were mad. They do not understand anything, and she, resigned to her fate, voluntarily goes to the palace to meet her doom. Aeschylus describes what happened next in his tragedy Agamemnon with chilling naturalism. The victorious king is taken to the baths so that he can wash off the dust of the road. And there, at the moment when he is unarmed and relaxed, a heavy, dense net is thrown over him, depriving him of the ability to move and resist. And Clytemnestra, his own wife, the woman who shared his bed, the mother of his children, strikes him 3 times with an axe. The first blow is for Iphigenia. The second is for the humiliation with Chryseis and other concubines. The third is as a sacrificial libation to the underground gods. The palace, which was supposed to be a place of triumph, turns into an altar on which the king himself is sacrificed. Cassandra is killed next. The bloody cycle begun by Tantalus has come full circle. Clytemnestra comes out to the people, axe in hand, splattered with her husband's blood, and without a hint of remorse announces what she has done. She does not consider herself a murderer. She is an instrument of justice, a priestess of vengeance, who has restored justice for the death of her daughter. Together with Aegisthus, she establishes tyranny in Mycenae. But the curse does not end there. Agamemnon has children left behind, his daughter Electra and his young son Orestes, whom loyal servants manage to secretly take out of the city. Years will pass, Orestes will grow up, and the Delphic oracle of Apollo will order him to return and avenge his father. This will be the most difficult choice of his life. To fulfill his filial duty, he will have to commit the gravest of sins, kill his own mother. And he will do it. By killing Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, he himself will become a victim of the curse. He will be hunted by the Erinyes, the ancient goddesses of vengeance, monstrous old women with snakes in their hair who drive matricides mad. Thus, the story of Agamemnon, the dark cardinal of Hellas, ends not with his death, but with the birth of a new era. Pursued by the Furies, Orestes finally reaches Athens, where the goddess Athena herself establishes a court over him, the Areopagus, a court of equal citizens. The judges' votes are evenly divided, and Athena's decisive vote acquits Orestes, finally breaking the endless chain of blood feuds. The tragedy of the House of Atreus, in which Agamemnon played one of the key and most sinister roles, becomes the mythological justification for the transition from the archaic law of an eye for an eye to civilized justice. And therein, perhaps, lies the main paradox of his legacy. The sins and sufferings of one of the most cruel and controversial heroes of Greek mythology became the bloody foundation on which a new, more just world was built. This blindness of the supreme leader did not arise out of nowhere, but was nurtured in the silence of the royal tent in Aulis during those sleepless nights that preceded the sacrifice. Euripides, in his tragedy Iphigenia in Aulis, depicts not a ruthless monster, but a man torn apart. We see Agamemnon, who, after sending the fateful letter to his wife, suddenly comes to his senses. By the light of a flickering lamp, he writes a second letter, begging Clytemnestra not to bring their daughter, cancelling everything. He gives it to his old faithful slave and orders him to run as fast as he can. This burst of humanity, this attempt to reverse the mechanism of horror that he himself has set in motion, makes his subsequent fall even deeper. But his brother, Menelaus, whose marital infidelity was the cause of the whole war, intercepts the letter. A fierce quarrel breaks out between the brothers, exposing the true nature of their relationship. Menelaus accuses Agamemnon of cowardice, reminding him how he fawned over other kings to be elected leader, and how now, having gained power, he is ready to betray the common cause. Agamemnon responds by throwing in his face that this whole war is just the whim of a cuckolded husband, not worth their daughter's little finger. For a moment, it seems that human feelings will prevail, but then a messenger arrives with news. Iphigenia is already in the camp. At that moment, Odysseus appears. The cunning king of Ithaca, a pragmatist to the core, explains a simple thing to Agamemnon. The army knows about the prophecy. The soldiers are eager to set sail. If Agamemnon refuses, the crowd, stirred up by Calchas himself, will simply tear him and his entire family to pieces. The choice is gone. All that remains is the illusion of choice, cold necessity. Agamemnon becomes a hostage not to the will of the gods, but to the will of the crowd and his own ambition. He has driven himself into a corner, and now, in order to save his own skin and his authority, he must cold-bloodedly watch as the priests drag his screaming daughter to the altar, gagging her so that her curses do not defile the ritual. It was this inner breakdown, this ability to step over everything for the sake of preserving formal power, that explains his further behavior at Troy. The conflict with Achilles was not just a quarrel between two men over a woman. It was a clash of two worldviews, two types of power. Agamemnon's power was inherited, structural, bureaucratic. He was king because his father was king, and he was the leader because the other kings had agreed so. Achilles' power was of a completely different nature. It was personal, earned in battle, based on his unsurpassed valor. He was the best, and everyone knew it. When Agamemnon took Briseis, he was not simply taking spoils. He was encroaching on the very essence of Achilles' honor, his tima, publicly demonstrating that formal power was superior to personal merit. Achilles, the embodiment of the heroic ideal, could not forgive this. Later, in an attempt to atone for his guilt, Agamemnon demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of what happened. He assembles an embassy to Achilles, but does not go himself. His pride prevents him. He sends Odysseus, Ajax, and Achilles' old tutor, Phoenix, with a whole list of gifts. 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 shiny cauldrons, 12 victorious horses, 7 beautiful captives from Lesbos, and of course, Briseis herself, whom, he swears, he has not even touched. He offers Achilles one of his 3 daughters as a wife and 7 rich cities as a dowry. From Agamemnon's point of view, this is more than generous compensation. He is trying to buy forgiveness, as if at a market. But Achilles' response is a condemnation of his entire value system. "I hate his gifts," says the hero. "I do not value them at all. Even if he gave me 10 times or 20 times more, even if he gave me as many gifts as there are grains of sand and specks of dust in the world, he would not convince my soul until he washed away this bitter insult." For Achilles, honor is not something that can be measured in gold or cities. Agamemnon, who thinks in terms of power and wealth, is fundamentally incapable of understanding this. And while the king demonstrated his incompetence on the battlefield and in diplomacy, in Mycenae, thousands of stadia from the Trojan coast, another quiet and terrible force was brewing. Clytemnestra, abandoned by her husband, was not just a grieving mother and forsaken wife. She was the daughter of the Spartan king Tyndareus and sister of the beautiful Helen, the very woman who had caused the war to begin. She was a woman of royal blood, intelligent, powerful, and determined. For 10 years, she had effectively ruled Mycenae, and by all accounts, she had ruled well. She maintained order, managed the economy, and kept the nobility in check. Her relationship with Aegisthus was not simply adultery born of loneliness. It was a well-thought-out political alliance. Aegisthus, as the last descendant of the cursed branch of the house of Atreus, had his own claim to the Mycenaean throne. By uniting, they created a powerful opposition to the absent king, legitimizing their power in the eyes of those who were dissatisfied with Agamemnon. Clytemnestra prepared her revenge, not with tears, but with the cold calculation of a statesman. She created a whole system of signal fires on the islands of the Aegean Sea, so that the news of Troy's fall would reach Mycenae at the very moment it happened. She wanted to be ready. The symbolism of her revenge was thought out to the smallest detail, turning a mundane murder into a sacred act, a terrible ritual of retribution. The purple carpets that Agamemnon walked on were not just a sign of luxury. Purple, a color extracted from thousands of sea mollusks, was fabulously expensive and associated with the gods and supreme royal power. By forcing her husband to step on them, Clytemnestra not only provoked him into an act of sacrilegious arrogance, but also symbolically forced him to walk the path woven from the blood of the sea to his own bloody demise. The bath, the place of murder, was also chosen for a reason. Washing after a long journey is a ritual of purification, of returning home. Clytemnestra turned this ritual into its opposite, defilement and death. She killed him at the moment of maximum vulnerability, naked and defenseless. The net, or in some versions, the long garment without openings for the arms and head that she threw over him, is a symbol of the inevitability of fate, an image that the Greeks used to describe the machinations of the gods. She caught him like a fisherman catches fish, like a hunter catches a beast. And finally, the weapon, a double-edged axe, a labrys. This is not a simple weapon, but the most ancient sacred symbol of the Cretan Mycenaean civilization, possibly used in sacrifices. And Clytemnestra, striking with this axe, seems to become a priestess herself, offering a retaliatory sacrifice. She kills the sacrificer with the same symbolic weapon with which he sacrificed their daughter. Every element of this murder was carefully calculated, transforming it from a crime of passion into the execution of a sentence handed down by fate itself. This obsession with fate, this feeling of being a grain of sand in the millstones of divine design, is the key to understanding not only Agamemnon, but his entire era. He lived in a world where a curse was not a metaphor, but a real, tangible force, passed down like a disease. The concept of miasma, ritual defilement, was central to the Greek worldview. The spilled blood of a relative created an invisible but deadly contamination that poisoned the earth, caused pestilence and infertility, and attracted more and more misfortune to the murderer and his descendants. The house of Atreus was thoroughly saturated with this miasma. Agamemnon was born and raised in this atmosphere of spiritual decay. Perhaps his reckless cruelty and arrogance were a form of fatalism. If your family is doomed anyway, if disaster is inevitable, what is the point of caution and piety? Perhaps he was trying to break the spell with his will, to prove that he, Agamemnon, was stronger than any curse. But each step he took only tightened the noose around his own neck. He sacrificed his daughter to appease the gods, but only incurred the wrath of the Furies. He insulted the priest of Apollo to assert his authority, but nearly destroyed the entire army. He humiliated Achilles to prove his superiority, thereby bringing the entire Greek army to the brink of defeat. He was not so much a dark cardinal plotting behind the throne as a blind giant who, in an attempt to dispel the darkness around him, only destroyed everything he touched, led by the invisible hand of a family curse to his predestined and terrible end. It is worth remembering that the coalition he led was not a monolithic army, but rather a powder keg of ambitions. Every king who brought his ships to Aulis, from the cunning Odysseus to the fierce Diomedes and the mighty Ajax, was a sovereign in his own lands. They obeyed Agamemnon not out of slavish devotion, but because of a fragile agreement in which he was merely first among equals. Every order he gave, every decision he made, was scrutinized by dozens of jealous eyes. His arrogance was not so much a character trait as a necessary political mask. Any show of weakness, any concession, would have been immediately interpreted as an inability to lead, and the entire fragile alliance would have fallen apart before reaching Troy. The calm in Aulis was not just a natural phenomenon, but a political crisis of the highest order. He found himself trapped. To disband the fleet would mean admitting defeat before the war had even begun, losing face and, possibly, the Mycenaean throne. To continue waiting would mean bringing the army, exhausted by idleness and hunger, to mutiny. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, in this cold logic of power, became the only way out, a monstrous act that was supposed not only to appease the goddess, but also to demonstrate to all the other kings that his will to win knew no bounds, that he was ready to pay a price unthinkable to any of them. It was a gesture of absolute, almost divine power, designed to put an end to any doubts about his leadership once and for all. During those 10 years while Agamemnon was asserting his power beneath the walls of Troy, Clytemnestra was undergoing her own, no less terrifying transformation in Mycenae. From a royal wife and mother, she became an autonomous ruler. She did not simply mourn her daughter. She learned to govern the state, forge alliances, navigate palace intrigues, and suppress the discontent of the nobility. Mycenae did not fall into decline under her rule. She proved, first and foremost to herself, that she could rule as well as any man. Her affair with Aegisthus was not just a consolation in the arms of another man. It was a political pact sealed by mutual hatred. Aegisthus, the bearer of his family's ancient grudge, gave her legitimacy in the eyes of those who remembered Atreus's crimes. She gave him access to the throne he could only dream of. Together, they created a shadow government that was just waiting for its moment. So when Agamemnon returned, he was confronted not with a grief-stricken wife who had betrayed him, but with a political figure equal to him in strength and cunning, who had built her own power base over 10 years and had no intention of giving it up. His murder was not only an act of revenge, but also a coup d'état, the elimination of a rival whose return threatened to destroy the new order she had built. She did not simply kill her husband, she killed the king in order to remain queen. The most terrifying and reliable testimony about his last moments has come down to us not from the mouths of tragedians, but from the ghostly whisper of Agamemnon himself. In the Odyssey, Homer sends his hero to the realm of the dead, where he meets the shadows of his fallen comrades. And there, in the gloom of Hades, the shadow of the king of Mycenae approaches him. His story is devoid of heroic pathos. It is a naked, desperate cry of a deceived man. He tells Odysseus not about purple carpets and ritual axes, but about the mundane, animalistic cruelty of his end. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra welcomed him with honors and threw a feast. And there, among his feasting comrades, he and his men were ambushed. "You have seen many terrible deaths in your life," his shadow says to Odysseus, "but you would not have seen anything more horrible than how we lay there, by the wine jugs and full tables, and the whole floor was covered in blood. The most pitiful cry I heard was that of Cassandra, daughter of Priam, whom the treacherous Clytemnestra killed next to me. As I was dying, I tried to raise my hands, but she, the dog, turned away and did not even close my eyes and mouth when I descended into Hades." There is nothing of high tragedy in his story, only filth and betrayal. He and his men were slaughtered like white-toothed pigs at the slaughterhouse, at a feast in their own home. This first-hand account from the brink of life and death finally strips Agamemnon of his mask as a great commander and leaves only the image of a victim whose greatest victory turned into the most humiliating defeat. His shadow wanders eternally restless in Hades, symbolizing the futility of earthly glory, which cannot protect against a knife in the back in one's own bathroom. All the splendor of Trojan gold, all the glory of victory, proved powerless against the quiet hatred that had built up over the years in the heart of the woman whose child he had given up to be sacrificed. He won the greatest war of his time, but lost the most important battle, within his own family, within the walls of his own home. The curse of the house of Atreus caught up with him not on the battlefield, where death is honorable, but in an inglorious domestic massacre, turning him from a hero into a cautionary tale about how the most terrible threat often lurks not behind enemy walls, but behind one's own doorstep. His return, Nostos, was supposed to be the crowning glory of his fame, the final chord of a victorious symphony. But for the Greeks, returning home was a trial no less terrible than the war itself. Agamemnon, who had destroyed the walls of Troy, was completely blind to the cracks in the foundations of his own home. He did not see that during his 10 years of absence, Clytemnestra had ceased to be just a woman. As the chorus of elders in Aeschylus's tragedy would say of her, she had acquired the heart of a man-counselor, androbouloncaire. She had learned to think strategically, to wait and strike with the cold precision of a commander, which he himself so often lacked. The elders of Mycenae who met him at the gates sensed this underlying horror. Their joyful greetings sounded false, interrupted by the ominous cawing of crows that only Cassandra could hear. They represented a people whose expectations had been betrayed. They had hoped for peace and prosperity, but instead they got a new tyrant in the form of Aegisthus and a queen with blood on her hands. Their powerless murmurs in the background of the tragedy are the voice of history, watching as a great triumph turns into a dirty palace coup. Meanwhile, in the palace, turned into a prison, his daughter Electra was already beginning to nurture her hatred, living as a slave to her murderous mother. And in distant Phocis, the exile Orestes was growing up, not knowing his father, but having absorbed his duty with his wet nurse's milk, to become the next instrument of damnation. The poison spilled in that fateful bath did not remain in the past. It was already poisoning the future, ensuring that the final act of this bloody drama had not yet been written. Agamemnon remains a complex figure, whose ambitions and actions led to a chain reaction of violence, from sacrifice to treacherous murder. His story reminds us that even the greatest rulers are not immune to the consequences of their sins, leaving lessons about the price of power and family curses that are still relevant today. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video,